Chapter 4. What Caspian Did There. Next morning the Lord Byrne called his guests early, and after breakfast he asked Caspian to order every man he had into full armour. And above all, let everything be as trim and scoured as if it were the morning of the first battle in a great war between noble kings, with all the world looking on. This was done, and then in 3 boatloads Caspian and his people, and Byrne with a few of his, put out for Narrowhaven. The king's flag flew in the stern of his boat, and his trumpeter was with him. When they reached the jetty at Narrowhaven, Caspian found a considerable crowd assembled to meet them. "This is what I sent word about last night. They are all friends of mine and honest people." And as soon as Caspian stepped ashore, the crowd broke out into hurrahs and shouts of "Narnia, Narnia, long live the king!" At the same moment, and this was also due to Byrne's messengers, bells began ringing from many parts of the town. Then Caspian caused his banner to be advanced, and his trumpet to be blown, and every man drew his sword and set his face into a joyful sternness. And they marched up the street, so that the street shook, and their armour shone, for it was a sunny morning, so that one could hardly look at it steadily. At first the only people who cheered were those who had been warned by Byrne's messenger, and knew what was happening, and wanted it to happen. But then all the children joined in, because they liked a procession, and had seen very few. And then all the schoolboys joined in, because they also liked processions, and felt the more noise and disturbance there was, the less likely they would be to have any school that morning. And then all the old women put their heads out of doors and windows and began chattering and cheering because it was a king, and what is a governor compared with that? And all the young women joined in for the same reason, and also because Caspian and Drinian and the rest were so handsome. And then all the young men came to see what the young women were staring at. So by the time Caspian reached the castle gates, nearly the whole town was shouting. And where Gumpus sat in his castle, muddling and messing about with accounts and forms and rules and regulations, he heard the noise. At the castle gate, Caspian's trumpeter blew a blast, and cried, "Open for the King of Narnia, come to visit his trusty and well-beloved servant, the governor of the Lone Islands." In those days everything in the islands was done in a slovenly, slouching manner. Only the little postern opened, and out came a tousled fellow with a dirty old hat on his head instead of a helmet, and a rusty old pike in his hand. He blinked at the flashing figures before him. "Can't see, he mumbled, which was his way of saying, "You can't see his sufficiency." "No envious appointments sat 'tween 9 and 10, second Saturday every month." "Uncover before Narnia, you dog!" thundered the Lord Byrne, and dealt him a rap with his gauntleted hand, which sent his hat flying from his head. "What's it all about?" began the doorkeeper, but no one took any more notice of him. 2 of Caspian's men stepped through the postern, and after some struggling with bars and bolts, for everything was rusty, flung both wings of the gate wide open. Then the king and his followers strode into the courtyard. Here a number of the governor's guards were lounging about, and several more, they were mostly wiping their mouths, came tumbling out of various doorways. Though their armour was in a disgraceful condition, these were fellows who might have fought if they had been led or had known what was happening. So this was a dangerous moment. Caspian gave them no time to think. "Where is the captain?" "I am, more or less, if you know what I mean," said a languid and rather dandified young person without any armour at all. "It is our wish that our royal visitation to our realm of the Lone Islands should, if possible, be an occasion of joy, and not of terror to our loyal subjects. If it were not for that, I should have something to say about the state of your men's armour and weapons. As it is, you are pardoned. Command a cask of wine to be opened, that your men may drink our health. but at noon tomorrow I wish to see them here in this courtyard, looking like men-at-arms and not like vagabonds. See to it on pain of our extreme displeasure." The captain gaped, but Byrne immediately cried, "Three cheers for the king!" And the soldiers, who had understood about the cask of wine, even if they understood nothing else, joined in. Caspian then ordered most of his own men to remain in the courtyard. He, with Byrne and Drinian and 4 others, went into the hall. Behind a table at the far end, with various secretaries about him, sat his sufficiency, the governor of the Lone Islands. Gumpus was a bilious-looking man, with hair that had once been red and was now mostly grey. He glanced up as the strangers entered, and then looked down at his papers.
"No interviews without appointments, except between 9 and 10 p.m. on second Saturdays."
Caspian nodded to Byrne, and then stood aside. Byrne and Drinian took a step forward, and each seized one end of the table. They lifted it and flung it on one side of the hall, where it rolled over, scattering a cascade of letters, dossiers, inkpots, pens, sealing-wax, and documents. Then, not roughly but firmly, as if their hands were pincers of steel, they plucked Gumpus out of his chair and deposited him, facing it, about 4 feet away. Caspian at once sat down in the chair and laid his naked sword across his knees. "My lord," said he, fixing his eyes on Gumpus, "you have not given us quite the welcome we expected. We are the King of Narnia."
"There's nothing about it in the correspondence. Nothing in the minutes. We have not been notified of any such thing. It's all irregular. I'm happy to consider any applications."
"And we are come to inquire into your sufficiency's conduct of your office. There are 2 points especially on which I require an explanation. Firstly, I have received no record that the tribute due from these islands to the crown of Narnia has been received for about 150 years.
"That would be a question to raise at the council next month, if anyone moves that a commission of inquiry be set up to report on the financial history of the islands at the first meeting next year. Why, then,
I also find it very clearly written in our laws that if the tribute is not delivered, the whole debt has to be paid by the governor of the Lone Islands, out of his private purse." At this, Gumpus began to pay real attention.
"That is quite out of the question. It's an economic impossibility. Your Majesty must be joking."
Inside, he was wondering if there were any way of getting rid of these unwelcome visitors. Had he known that Caspian had only 1 ship and 1 ship's company with him, he would have spoken soft words for a moment, and hoped to have them all surrounded and killed during the night. But he had seen a ship of war sail down the straits yesterday, and seen it signalling, as he supposed, to its consorts. He had not then known it was the king's ship, for there was not wind enough to spread the flag and make the Golden Lion visible, so he had waited further developments. Now he imagined that Caspian had a whole fleet at Bernstead. It would never have occurred to Gumpus that anyone would walk into Narrowhaven to take the islands with less than 50 men. It was certainly not the kind of thing he would imagine doing himself. "Secondly," said Caspian, "I want to know why you have permitted the abominable and unnatural traffic in slaves to grow up here, contrary to the ancient custom and usage of our domains."
"It's necessary, unavoidable. It's an essential part of the economic development of the islands, I assure you. Our present burst of prosperity depends on it."
"What need have you of slaves?"
"For export, your Majesty. We sell them to Calorman mostly, but we have other markets. We are a great centre of the trade."
"In other words, you don't need them. Tell me what purpose they serve, except to put money into the pockets of such as Pug."
"Your Majesty's tender years,"
said Gumpus, with what was meant to be a fatherly smile,
"hardly make it possible that you should understand the economic problem involved. I have statistics, I have graphs, I have—"
"Tender as my ears may be, I believe I understand the slave trade from within quite as well as your sufficiency. and I do not see that it brings to these islands meat or bread or beer or wine or timber or cabbages or books or instruments of music or horses or armour or anything else worth having. But whether it does or not, it must be stopped."
"But that would be putting the clock back. Have you no idea of progress, of development?"
"I have seen them both in an egg. We call it going bad in Narnia. This trade must stop."
"I can take no responsibility for any such measure."
"Very well, then. We relieve you of your office. My Lord Byrne, come here." And before Gumpus quite realized what was happening, Byrne was kneeling with his hands between the king's hands, and taking the oath to govern the Lone Islands in accordance with the old customs, rites, usages, and laws of Narnia. And Caspian said, "I think we have had enough of governors," and made Byrne a duke, the Duke of the Lone Islands. "As for you, my lord, I forgive you your debt for the tribune, but before noon tomorrow you and yours must be out of the castle, which is now the Duke's residence."
"Now look here, this is all very well," said one of Gumpus's secretaries, "but suppose all you gentlemen stop play-acting and we do a little business. The question before us really is—"
"The question," said the Duke, "is whether you and the rest of your rabble will leave without a flogging or with one. You may choose which you prefer." When all this had been pleasantly settled, Caspian ordered horses, of which there were a few in the castle, though very ill-groomed, and he, with Byrne and Drinian and a few others, rode out into the town and made for the slave market. It was a long, low building near the harbour, and the scene which they found going on inside was very much like any other auction. That is to say, there was a great crowd, and Pug, on a platform, was roaring out in a raucous voice.
"Now, gentlemen, lot 23, a fine Terebinthian agricultural labourer, suitable for the mines or the galleys, under 25 years of age, not a bad tooth in his head, good brawny fellow, take off his shirt-tacks, let the gentleman see. There's muscle for you. Look at the chest on him. 10 crescents from a gentleman in the corner. Ho, ho, ho! You must be joking, sir. 15, 18 is bidden for lot 23. Any advance on 18? 21, thank you, sir, 21.
But Pug stopped and gaped when he saw the mail-clad figures who had clanked up onto the platform. "On your knees, every one of you, to the King of Narnia!" Everyone heard the horses jingling and stamping outside, and many had heard some rumour of the landing and the events at the castle. Most obeyed. Those who did not were pulled down by their neighbours. Some cheered. "Your life is forfeit, Pug, for laying hands on our royal person yesterday," said Caspian. "But your ignorance is pardoned. The slave trade was forbidden in all our dominions 1/4 of an hour ago. I declare every slave in this market free." He held up a hand to check the cheering of the slaves. "Where are my friends?"
That dear little girl and the nice gentleman, they were snapped up at once."
We're here, Caspian!" cried Lucy and Edmund together.
"At your service, sire!"
piped Reaping Sheep from another corner. They'd all been sold, but the men who'd bought them were staying to bid for other slaves, so they'd not yet been taken away. The crowd parted to let the 3 of them out, and there were great hand-claspings and greetings between them and Caspian. 2 merchants of Calormen at once approached. The Calormen have dark faces and long beards. They wear flowing robes and orange-coloured turbans. They are wise, wealthy, courteous, a cruel and ancient people too. They bowed most politely to Caspian, and paid him long compliments, all about the fountains of prosperity, irrigating the gardens of prudence and virtue, things like that. But of course what they wanted was their money back. "Well, that is only fair, sirs. Every man who has bought a slave today must have his money back. Pug, bring out your takings to the last minim." A minim is the 40th part of a crescent.
"Does your good majesty mean to beggar me?"
You have lived on broken hearts all your life, and if you are beggared, it is better to be a beggar than a slave. Now, Where is my other friend?
Ah, him! You can take him and welcome. Glad to have him off my hands. I've never seen such a drag in the market in all my born days. I priced him at 5 crescents in the end, even then nobody'd have him. I threw him in free with other lots, and still no one would have him. Wouldn't touch him, wouldn't look at him. Tax, bring out Sulky.
Thus Eustace was produced, and sulky he certainly looked. For though no one would want to be sold as a slave, it is perhaps even more galling to be a sort of utility slave whom no one will buy. He walked up to Caspian and said,
I see, as usual. Been enjoying yourself somewhere while the rest of us were prisoners. I suppose you haven't even found out about the British consul? Of course not.
That night they had a great feast in the castle of Narrowhaven. And then,
tomorrow, the beginning of our real adventures,
said Reaping Sheep, when he had made his bows to everyone and went to bed. But it could not really be tomorrow or anything like it, for now they were preparing to leave all known lands and seas behind them, and the fullest preparations had to be made. The Dawn Treader was emptied and drawn on land by 8 horses over rollers, and every bit of her was gone over by the most skilled shipwrights. Then she was launched again, and victualled and watered as full as she could hold, that is to say, for 28 days. Even this, as Edmund noticed with disappointment, only gave them a fortnight's eastward sailing before they had to abandon their quest. While all this was being done, Caspian missed no chance of questioning all the oldest sea captains whom he could find in Narrowhaven, to learn if they had any knowledge or even rumours of land further to the east. He poured out many a flagon of the castle ale to weather-beaten men with short grey beards and clear blue eyes, and many a tall yarn he heard in return. But those who seemed the most truthful could tell of no lands beyond the Lone Islands, and many thought that if you sailed too far east, you would come into the surges of a sea without lands that swirled perpetually around the rim of the world.
And that, I reckon, is where your Majesty's friends went to the bottom, said one.
The rest had only wild stories of islands inhabited by headless men, floating islands or waterspouts, and a fire that burned along the water. Only one, to Reaping Sheep's delight, said,
and beyond that, Aslan's country. But that's beyond the end of the world, and you can't get there.
And when they questioned him more, he could only say he'd heard it from his father. Byrne could only tell them that he had seen his 6 companions sail away eastward, and that nothing had been heard of them again. He said this when he and Caspian were standing on the highest point of Avra, looking down on the eastern ocean. I've often been up here of a morning, said the Duke, and seen the sun come up out of the sea, and sometimes it looked as if it were only a couple of miles away. And I've wondered about my friends, and I've wondered what there really is behind that horizon. Nothing, most likely. Yet I'm always half ashamed that I stayed behind. But I wish your Majesty wouldn't go. We may need your help here. This closing the slave market might make a new world. War with Calormen is what I foresee. My liege, think again.
I have an oath, my Lord Duke.
And anyway, what could I say to Reaping Sheep? Chapter 5. The Storm and What Came of It. It was nearly 3 weeks after their landing that the Dawn Treader was towed out of Narrowhaven harbour. Very solemn farewells had been spoken, and a great crowd had assembled to see her departure. There had been cheers, and tears too, when Caspian made his last speech to the Lone Islanders, and parted from the Duke and his family. But as the ship, her purple sails still flapping idly, drew further from the shore, and the sound of Caspian's trumpet from the poop came fainter across the water, everyone became silent. Then she came into the wind. The sail swelled out, the tug cast off and began rowing back. The first real wave ran up under the Dawn Treader's prow, and she was a live ship again. The men off duty went below. Drinian took the first watch on the poop, and she turned her head eastwards towards the south of Havre. The next few days were delightful. Lucy thought she was the most fortunate girl in the world. She woke each morning to see the reflections of the sunlit water dancing on the ceiling of her cabin, and looked round on all the nice new things she'd got in the Lone Islands, sea boots and buskins and cloaks and jerkins and scarves. And then she would go on deck and take a look from the forecastle at a sea that was brighter blue each morning, and drink in an air that was a little warmer every day. After that came breakfast, and such an appetite as only one has at sea. She spent a good deal of time sitting on the little bench in the stern playing chess with Reepicheep. It was amusing to see him lifting the pieces, which were far too big for him, with both paws, and standing on tiptoes if he made a move nearer the centre of the board. He was a good player, and when he remembered what he was doing, he usually won. But every now and then Lucy won, because the mouse did something quite ridiculous, like sending a knight into the danger of a queen and castle combined. This happened because he momentarily forgot it was a game of chess, and was thinking of a real battle, and making the knight do what he would certainly have done in its place. For his mind was full of forlorn hopes, death or glory charges, and last stands. But this pleasant time did not last. There came an evening when Lucy, gazing idly astern at the long furrow or wake they were leaving behind them, saw a great rack of clouds building itself up in the west with amazing speed. Then a gap was torn in it, and a yellow sunset poured through the gap. All the waves behind them seemed to take on unusual shapes, and the sea was a drab or yellowish colour, like dirty canvas. The air grew cold. The ship seemed to move uneasily, as if she felt danger behind her. The sail would be flat and limp one minute and wildly full the next. Whilst she was noting these things, and wondering at the sinister change which had come over the very noise of the wind, Drinian cried, "All hands on deck!" In a moment everyone became frantically busy. The hatches were battened down, the galley fire was put out, men went aloft to reef the sail. Before they'd finished, the storm struck them. It seemed to Lucy a great valley in the sea opened up just before their bows, and they rushed down into it, deeper down than she would have believed possible. A great grey hill of water, far higher than the mast, rushed to meet them. It looked certain death, but they were tossed to the top of it. Then the ship seemed to spin round. A cataract of water poured over the deck. The poop and forecastle were like two islands with a fierce sea between them. Up aloft the sailors were lying out along the yard, desperately trying to get control of the sail. A broken rope stood out sideways in the wind, as stiff and straight as if it was a poker. "Get below, ma'am!" And Lucy, knowing that landsmen and landswomen are a nuisance to the crew, began to obey. But it was not easy. The Dawn Treader was listing terribly to starboard, and the deck sloped like the roof of a house. She had to clamber round to the top of the ladder, holding on to the rail, and then stand by while two men climbed up it, and then get down it as best she could. It was well she was already holding on tight, for at the foot of the ladder another wave roared across the deck, up to her shoulders. She was already wet through with spray and rain, but this was colder. Then she made a dash for the cabin door, and got in and shut out for a moment the appalling sight of the speed with which they were rushing into the dark. But not, of course, the horrible confusion of creakings, groanings, snappings, clatterings, roarings, and boomings, which only sounded more alarming below than they had done on the poop. And all the next day, and the next, it went on. It went on till one could hardly remember a time before it had begun. And there always had to be 3 men at the tiller, and it was as much as 3 could do to keep any kind of course. And there always had to be a man at the pump, and there was hardly any rest for anyone, and nothing could be cooked and nothing could be dried, and one man was lost overboard, and they never saw the sun. When it was over, Eustace made the following entry in his diary.
September 3rd, the first day for ages when I've been able to write. We've been driven before a hurricane for 13 days and nights. I know, because I kept a careful count, though the others all say it was 12. Oh, it's pleasant to be embarked on a dangerous voyage with people who can't even count right. I had a ghastly time. up and down enormous waves, hour after hour, usually wet to the skin, and not even an attempt to give us proper meals. Needless to say, there's no wireless or even no rocket, no chance of signalling anyone for help. It all proves what I keep on telling them, the madness of setting out in a rotten little tub like this. It would be bad enough even if one was with decent people instead of fiends in human form. Caspian and Edmund are simply brutal to me. The night we lost our mast, there's only a stump left now, though I was not at all well, they forced me to come on deck and work like a slave. Lucy shoved her oar in by saying that Reaping Sheep was longing to go, only he was too small. I wonder she doesn't see that everything that little beast does is all for the sake of showing off. Even at her age she ought to have that amount of sense. Today the beastly boat is level at last, and the sun's out, and we've all been jawing about what to do. We have food enough, pretty beastly stuff most of it, to last for 16 days. The poultry were all washed overboard. Even if they hadn't been, the storm would have stopped them laying. The real trouble is water. 2 casks seem to have got a leak knocked in them, and they're empty. Narnian efficiency again. On short rations, half a pint a day each, we've got enough for 12 days. There's still lots of rum and wine, but even they realise that would only make them thirstier. If we could, of course, the sensible thing would be to turn west at once and make for the Lone Islands. But it took us 18 days to get where we are, running like mad with a gale behind us. Even if we got an east wind, it might take us longer to get back. And at present there's no sign of an east wind. No wind at all. As for rowing back, it would take far too long. Caspian says the men couldn't row on half a pint of water a day. I'm pretty sure this is wrong. I tried to explain that perspiration really cools people down, so the men would need less water if they were working. But he didn't take any notice of this, which is always his way when he can't think of an answer. The others all voted for going on, in the hope of finding land. I felt it was my duty to point out that we didn't even know there was any land ahead, and I tried to get them to see the dangers of wishful thinking. Instead of producing a better plan, they had the cheek to ask me what I proposed. So I just explained, coolly and quietly, that I had been kidnapped and brought away on this idiotic voyage without my consent, and it was hardly my business to get them out of their scrape. September 4th. Still becalmed, very short rations for dinner, and I got less than anyone. Caspian's very clever at helping and thinks I don't see. Lucy, for some reason, tried to make it up to me by offering me some of hers, but that interfering prig Edmund wouldn't let her. Pretty hot sun. Terribly thirsty all evening. September 5th. Still becalmed and very hot, feeling rotten all day, and I'm sure I've got a temperature. Of course, they haven't the sense to have a thermometer on board. September 6th. A horrible day. Woke up in the night, knowing I was feverish and must have a drink of water. Any doctor would have said so. Heaven knows I'm the last person to try to get an unfair advantage. But I never dreamed this water rationing was meant to apply to a sick man. In fact, I would have woken the others up and asked them for some, only I thought it would be selfish to wake them. So I just got up, and I took my cup, and I tiptoed out of the black hole we sleep in, taking great care not to disturb Caspian and Edmund, for they've been sleeping badly since the heat and the short water began. I always try to consider others, whether they are nice to me or not. I got out all right into the big room, if you can call it a room, where the rowing benches and the luggage are, and the thing of the water in it is at the end. It's all going beautifully, but before I'd drawn a cupful, who should catch me but that little spy Reap? I tried to explain that I was going on deck for a breath of air. The business of the water was nothing to do with him. And he asked me why I had a cup. He made such a noise, the whole ship was roused. They treated me scandalously. I asked, as I think anyone would, why Reaping Sheep was sneaking round the water cask in the middle of the night. He said he was too small to be any use on deck, so he did sentry duty over the water every night, so one more man could go to sleep. Now comes their rotten unfairness. They all believed him. Can you beat it? I had to apologise, or the dangerous little brute would have been at me with his sword. And then Caspian showed up in his true colours, the brutal tyrant he is, and said out loud for everyone to hear that anyone found stealing water in future would get 2 dozen. I didn't know what that meant till Edmund explained it to me. It comes in the sort of books those Pevensey kids read. And after this cowardly threat, Caspian changed his tune and started being patronising. Said he was sorry for me, and everyone felt just as feverish as I did, and we must all make the best of it, etc., etc. Oh dear, stuck-up prig. Stayed in bed all day today. September 7th. A little wind today, but still from the west. Made a few miles eastward with part of a sail set on what Drinian calls the jury mast. That means the bowsprit set upright and tied, they call it lashed, to the stump of a real mast. Still terribly thirsty. September 8th. Still sailing east. I stay in my bunk all day now, and I see no one except Lucy, till the 2 fiends come to bed. Lucy gives me a little of her water ration. She says girls don't get as thirsty as boys, and I'd often thought that was true. It ought to be more generally known at sea. September 9th. Land in sight, a very high mountain a long way off to south-east. September 10th. The mountain's bigger and clearer, still a long way off. Gulls again today, for the first time since I don't know how long. September 11th. Caught some fish and had them for dinner. Dropped anchor at about 7 p.m. in 3 fathoms of water in a bay of this mountainous island. That idiot Caspian wouldn't let us go ashore because it was getting dark and he was afraid of savages and wild beasts. Extra water ration tonight.
What awaited them on this island was going to concern Eustace more than anyone else, but it cannot be told in his words, because after September the 11th, he forgot about keeping his diary for a long time. When morning came, with a low grey sky, but very hot, the adventurers found they were in a bay encircled by such cliffs and crags it was like a Norwegian fjord. In front of them, at the head of the bay, there was some level land heavily overgrown with trees that appeared to be cedars, through which a rapid stream came out. Beyond that was a steep ascent ending in a jagged ridge, and behind that a vague darkness of mountains which ran into dull-coloured clouds, so that you could not see their tops. The nearer cliffs at each side of the bay were streaked here and there with lines of white, which everyone knew to be waterfalls, though at that distance they did not show any movement or make any noise. Indeed, the whole place was very silent, and the water of the bay as smooth as glass. It reflected every detail of the cliffs. The scene would have been pretty in a picture, but was rather oppressive in real life. It was not a country that welcomed visitors. The whole ship's company went ashore in 2 boatloads, and everyone drank and washed deliriously in the river, and had a meal and a rest before Caspian sent 4 men back to keep the ship, and the day's work began. There was everything to be done. The casks must be brought ashore, and the faulty ones mended if possible, and all refilled. A tree, a pine, if they could get it, must be felled and made into a new mast. Sails must be repaired. A hunting party organised to shoot any game the land might yield. Clothes to be washed and mended, and countless small breakages on board to be set right. For the Dawn Treader herself, and this was more obvious now that they saw her at a distance, could hardly be recognised as the same gallant ship which had left Narrowhaven. She looked a crippled, discoloured hulk, which anyone might have taken for a wreck, and her officers and crew were no better, lean, pale, red-eyed from lack of sleep, and dressed in rags. As Eustace lay under a tree and heard all these plans being discussed, his heart sank. Was there going to be no rest? It looked as if their first day on the longed-for land was going to be quite as hard work as a day at sea. Then a delightful idea occurred to him. Nobody was looking. They were all chattering about their ship as if they actually liked the beastly thing. Why shouldn't he simply slip away? He could take a stroll inland, find a cool, airy place up in the mountains, have a good long sleep, and not rejoin the others till the day's work was over. He felt it would do him good. But he'd take great care to keep the bay and the ship in sight, so as to be sure of his way back. He wouldn't like to be left behind in this country. He at once put his plan into action. He rose quietly from his place and walked away among the trees, taking care to go slowly and in an aimless manner, so that anyone who saw him would think he was merely stretching his legs. He was surprised at how quickly the noise of conversation died away behind him, and how very silent and warm and dark green the wood became. Soon he felt he could venture on at a quicker and more determined stride. This soon brought him out of the wood. The ground began sloping steeply up in front of him. The grass was dry and slippery, but manageable if he used his hands as well as his feet, and though he panted and mopped his forehead a good deal, he plugged away steadily. This showed, by the way, that his new life, little as he suspected it, had already done him some good. The old Eustace, Harold and Alberta's Eustace, would have given up the climb after about 10 minutes. Slowly, and with several rests, he reached the ridge. Here he had expected to have a view into the heart of the island, but the clouds had now come lower and nearer, and a sea of fog was rolling to meet them. He sat down and looked back. He was now so high that the bay looked small beneath him, and miles of sea were visible. Then the fog from the mountains closed in all around him, thick but not cold, and he lay down and turned this way and that to find the most comfortable position to enjoy himself. But he didn't enjoy himself, not for long anyway. He began, almost for the first time in his life, to feel lonely. At first this feeling grew very gradually, and then he began to worry about the time. There was not the slightest sound. Suddenly it occurred to him that he might have been lying here for hours. Perhaps the others had gone. Perhaps they'd let him wander away on purpose, simply in order to leave him behind. He leapt up in a panic and began the descent. At first he tried to do it too quickly, and slipped on the steep grass and slid for several feet. Then he thought this had carried him too far to the left, and as he came up he had seen precipices on that side. So he clambered up again as near as he could guess to the place he'd started from, and began the descent afresh, bearing to his right. After that things seemed to be going better. He went very cautiously, for he could not see more than a yard ahead, and there was still perfect silence all around him. It is very unpleasant to have to go cautiously, when there is a voice deep inside you saying all the time, "Hurry, hurry, hurry." For every moment the terrible idea of being left behind grew stronger. If he had understood Caspian and the Pevensies at all, he would have known, of course, that there was not the least chance of their doing any such thing. But he persuaded himself that they were all fiends in human form. "At last," said Eustace, as he came slithering down a slide of loose stones, scree they call it, and found himself on the level. "Now, where are those trees? There's something dark ahead. Why, I do believe the fog's clearing." It was. The light increased every moment and made him blink. The fog lifted. He was in an utterly unknown valley, and the sea was nowhere in sight. Chapter 6. The Adventures of Eustace. At that very moment the others were washing hands and faces in the river, and generally getting ready for dinner and a rest. The 3 best archers had gone up into the hills north of the bay, and returned laden with a pair of wild goats, which were now roasting over a fire. Caspian had ordered a cask of wine ashore, strong wine of Aachen land, which had to be mixed with water before you drank it, so there would be plenty for all. The work had gone well so far, and it was a merry meal. Only after the second helping of goat did Edmund say, "Where's the blighter Eustace?" Meanwhile Eustace stared round the unknown valley. It was so narrow and deep, and the precipices which surrounded it so sheer, that it was like a huge pit or trench. The floor was grassy, though strewn with rocks, and here and there Eustace saw black burnt patches, like those you see at the sides of a railway embankment in a dry summer. About 15 yards away from him was a pool of clear, smooth water. There was, at first, nothing else at all in the valley, not an animal, not a bird, not an insect. The sun beat down, and grim peaks and horns of mountains peered over the valley's edge. Eustace realized, of course, that in the fog he had come down the wrong side of a ridge. So he turned at once to see about getting back, but as soon as he'd looked, he shuddered. Apparently he had, by amazing luck, found the only possible way down. A long green spit of land, horribly steep and narrow, with precipices on either side. There was no other possible way of getting back. But could he do it, now that he saw what it was really like? His head swam at the very thought of it. He looked round again, thinking that at any rate he'd better have a good drink from the pool first. But as soon as he had turned, and before he'd taken a step forward into the valley, he heard a noise behind him. It was only a small noise, but it sounded loud in that immense silence. It froze him dead still where he stood for a second. Then he slewed round his neck and looked. At the bottom of the cliff, a little to the left hand, was a low, dark hole, the entrance to a cave, perhaps, and out of this 2 thin wisps of smoke were coming. And the loose stones just beneath the dark hollow were moving, and that was the noise he had heard, just as if something were crawling in the dark behind them. Something was crawling. Worse still, something was coming out. Edmund or Lucy or you would have recognized it at once, but Eustace had read none of the right books. The thing that came out of the cave was something he had never even imagined. A long, lead-coloured snout, dull red eyes, no feathers or fur, a long, lithe body that trailed on the ground, legs whose elbows went up higher than its back like a spider's, cruel claws, bat's wings that made a rasping noise on the stones, yards of tail, and the lines of smoke were coming from its 2 nostrils. He never said the word dragon to himself, nor would it have made things any better if he had. But perhaps if he had known something about dragons, he would have been a little surprised at this dragon's behaviour. It did not sit up and clap its wings, nor did it shoot out a stream of flame from its mouth. The smoke from its nostrils was like the smoke of a fire that will not last much longer, nor did it seem to have noticed Eustace. It moved very slowly towards the pool, slowly and with many pauses. Even in his fear, Eustace felt that it was an old, sad creature. He wondered if he dared make a dash for the ascent, but it might look round if he made any noise. It might come more to life. Perhaps it was only shamming. Anyway, what was the use of trying to escape by climbing from a creature that can fly? It reached the pool and slid its horrible, scaly chin down over the gravel to drink. But before it had drunk, there came a great croaking or clanging cry, and after a few twitches and convulsions, it rolled round on its side and lay perfectly still, with one claw in the air. A little dark blood gushed from its wide-open mouth. The smoke from its nostrils turned black for a moment, and then floated away. No more came. For a long time Eustace did not dare move. Perhaps this was the brute's trick, the way it lured travellers to their doom. But he couldn't wait forever. He took a step nearer, then 2 steps, and halted again. The dragon remained motionless. He noticed, too, that the red fire had gone out of its eyes. And at last he came up to it. He was quite sure now that it was dead. With a shudder, he touched it. Nothing happened. The relief was so great that Eustace almost laughed out loud. He began to feel as if he'd fought and killed the dragon, instead of merely seeing it die. He stepped over it and went to the pool for a drink, for the heat was getting unbearable. He was not surprised when he heard a peal of thunder. Almost immediately afterward the sun disappeared, and before he had finished his drink, big drops of rain were falling. The climate of this island was a very unpleasant one. In less than a minute Eustace was wet to the skin and half blinded with such rain as one never sees in Europe. There was no use trying to climb out of a valley as long as this lasted, so he bolted for the only shelter in sight, the dragon's cave. There he lay down and tried to get his breath. Most of us would know what to expect in a dragon's lair. As I have said before, though, Eustace had read only the wrong books. They'd had a lot to say about exports and imports, and governments and drains, but they were weak on dragons. This is why he was so puzzled at the surface on which he was lying. Parts of it were too prickly to be stones and too hard to be thorns, and there seemed to be a great many round flat things, and it all clinked when he moved. There was light enough at the cave's mouth to examine it by, and of course Eustace found it to be what any of us could have told him in advance: treasure. There were crowns, those were the prickly things, coins, rings, bracelets, ingots, cups, plates, and gems. Eustace, unlike most boys, had never thought much of treasure, but he saw at once the use it would be in this new world which he had so foolishly stumbled into through the picture in Lucy's bedroom at home.
They don't have any tax here, and you don't have to give treasure to the government. Well, with this stuff, I could have quite a decent time. Perhaps in Calorman. That sounds the least phony of these countries. I wonder how much I can carry. This bracelet now. Those things in it are probably diamonds. I'll slip that on my own wrist. Oh, too big. Oh, not if I push it right up here above my elbow. Then all my pockets with diamonds. That's easier than gold. I wonder when this infernal rain's going to let up. He got into a less uncomfortable part of the pile, where it is mostly coins, and settled down to wait. But a bad fright, when once it is over, and especially a bad fright following a mountain walk, leaves you very tired. Eustace fell asleep. By the time he was sound asleep and snoring, the others had finished dinner and become seriously alarmed about him.
Eustace! Eustace! Cooey!
Till they went hoarse, and Caspian blew his horn.
He's nowhere near, or he'd have heard that, said Lucy with a white face.
Confound the fellow, said Edmund. What on earth did he want to slink away like that for?
We must do something. He may have got lost or fallen into a hole, or he could have been captured by savages.
Or killed by wild beasts, said Drinian.
And a good riddance if he has, I say, muttered Rince.
Master Rince, said Reapy Cheep, you never spoke a word that became you less. The creature is no friend of mine, but he is of the Queen's blood, and while he is one of our fellowship, it concerns our honour to find and aid him, or avenge him if he is dead.
Of course we have to find him, if we can, said Caspian wearily. That's the nuisance of it. It means a search party and endless trouble. Oh, bother Eustace! Meanwhile Eustace slept and slept, and slept. What woke him was a pain in his arm. The moon was shining in the mouth of the cave, and the bed of treasures seemed to have grown much more comfortable. In fact, he could hardly feel it at all. But he was puzzled by the pain in his arm at first. But presently it occurred to him that the bracelet he had shoved up above his elbow had become strangely tight. The arm must have swollen while he was asleep. It was his left arm. He moved his right arm in order to feel his left, but stopped before he'd moved it an inch, and bit his lip in terror. For just in front of him, and a little to his right, where the moonlight fell clear on the floor of the cave, he saw a hideous shape moving. He knew that shape. It was a dragon's claw. It had moved as he moved his hand, and become still when he stopped moving his hand. What a fool I've been! The brute had a mate, of course, and it's lying beside me. For several minutes he did not dare to move a muscle. He saw two thin columns of smoke going up before his eyes, black against the moonlight, just as there had been smoke coming from the other dragon's nose before it died. This was so alarming that he held his breath. Two columns of smoke vanished. When he could hold his breath no longer, he let it out stealthily. Instantly 2 jets of smoke appeared again, but even yet he had no idea of the truth. Presently he decided that he would edge very cautiously to his left and try to creep out of the cave. Perhaps the creature was asleep, and anyway, it was his only chance. But of course before he edged to the left, he looked to the left, and oh horror! There was a dragon's claw on that side too. No one will blame Eustace if at that moment he shed tears. He was surprised at the size of his own tears as he saw them splashing onto the treasure in front of him. They also seemed strangely hot, and steam went up from them. But there was no good crying. He must try to crawl out between the two dragons. He began extending his right arm. The dragon's foreleg and claw on his right went through exactly the same motion. Then he thought he would try his left. The dragon's limb on that side moved too. 2 dragons, one on each side, mimicking whatever he did. His nerve broke. He simply made a bolt for it. There was such a clatter and rasping and clinking of gold and grinding of stones as he rushed out of the cave that he thought they were both following him. He daren't look back. He rushed to the pool. The twisted shape of a dead dragon lying in the moonlight would have been enough to frighten anyone, but now he hardly noticed it. The idea was to get into the water. But just as he reached the edge of the pool, 2 things happened. First of all, it came over him like a thunderclap that he'd been running on all 4s. Why on earth had he been doing that? And secondly, as he bent towards the water, he thought for a second that yet another dragon was staring up at him out of the pool. But in an instant he realized the truth. The dragon face in the pool was his own reflection. There was no doubt about it. It moved as he moved. It opened and shut its mouth as he opened and shut his. He had turned into a dragon while he was asleep. Sleeping on a dragon's hoard with greedy, dragonish thoughts in his heart, he had become a dragon himself. It explained everything. There had been no 2 dragons beside him in the cave. The claws to the right and left had been his own right and left claws. The 2 columns of smoke had been coming from his own nostrils. As for pain in his left arm, or what had been his left arm, he could now see what had happened by squinting with his left eye. The bracelet, which had fitted very nicely on the upper arm of a boy, was far too small for the thick, stumpy foreleg of a dragon. It had sunk deeply into his scaly flesh, and there was a throbbing bulge on each side of it. He tore at the place of his dragon's teeth, but he could not get it off. In spite of the pain, his first feeling was one of relief. There was nothing to be afraid of any more. He was a terror himself now, and nothing in the world but a knight, and not all of those, would dare to attack him. He could get even with Caspian and Edmund now. But the moment he thought this, he realized he didn't want to. He wanted to be friends. He wanted to get back among humans and talk and laugh and share things. He realized that he was a monster, cut off from the whole human race. An appalling loneliness came over him. He began to see that the others had not really been fiends at all. He began to wonder if he himself had been such a nice person as he'd always supposed. He longed for their voices. He would have been grateful for a kind word even from Reaping Sheep. When he thought of this, the poor dragon that had been Eustace lifted up its voice and wept. A powerful dragon crying its eyes out under the moon in a deserted valley is a sight and a sound hardly to be imagined. At last he decided he would try to find his way back to the shore. He realized now that Caspian would never have sailed away and left him, and he felt sure that somehow or other he would be able to make people understand who he was. He took a long drink, and then, I know this sounds shocking, but it isn't if you think it over, he ate nearly all the dead dragon. He was halfway through it before he realized what he was doing. For, you see, though his mind was the mind of Eustace, his tastes and his digestion were dragonish. And there is nothing a dragon likes so well as fresh dragon. That is why you so seldom find more than one dragon in the same country. Then he turned to climb out of the valley. He began the climb with a jump, and as soon as he jumped, he found he was flying. He had forgotten about his wings, and it was a great surprise to him. The first pleasant surprise he'd had for a very long time. He rose high into the air and saw innumerable mountain tops spread out beneath him in the moonlight. He could see the bay like a silver slab, and the Dawn Treader lying at anchor. and campfires twinkling in the woods beside the beach. From a great height he launched himself down towards them in a single glide. Lucy was sleeping very soundly, for she'd sat up till the return of a search party in the hope of good news. It had been led by Caspian, and had come back late and weary. The news was disquieting. They had found no trace of Eustace, but they had seen a dead dragon in a valley. They tried to make the best of it, and everyone assured everyone else that there were not likely to be more dragons about, and that the one that was dead at about 3 o'clock that afternoon, which was when they had seen it, would hardly have been killing people a few hours before. "Unless it ate the little brat and died of him. Eat poison anything," said Rince. But he said it under his breath, and no one heard it. But later in the night Lucy was wakened, very softly, and found the whole company gathered close together and talking in whispers. "What is it?" "We must all show great constancy. A dragon has flown over the tree-tops and lighted on the beach. Yes, I'm afraid it is between us and the ship. Arrows are no use against dragons, and they're not at all afraid of fire."
"With your Majesty's leave."
"No, Repeat-Sheep, you are not to attempt single combat with it, and unless you promise to obey me in this matter I will have you tied up. We must just keep close watch, and as soon as it is light go down to the beach and give it battle. I will lead. King Edmund will be on my right and the Lord Drinian on my left. There are no other arrangements to be made. It will be light in a couple of hours, and in an hour's time let a meal be served, and what is left of the wine. And let everything be done silently." "Perhaps it will go away." "It'll be worse for us if it does, Lou, because then we shan't know where it is. If there's a wasp in the room, I'd like to be able to see it." The rest of the night was dreadful, and when the meal came, though they knew they ought to eat, many found they had very poor appetites. And endless hours seemed to pass before the darkness thinned and birds began chirping here and there, and the world got colder and wetter than it had been all night. And Caspian said, "Now for it, friends." They got up, all with swords drawn, and formed themselves into a solid mass, with Lucy in the middle and Repeat-Sheep on her shoulder. It was nicer than the waiting about, and everyone felt fonder of everyone else than at ordinary times. A moment later they were marching. It grew lighter as they came to the edge of the wood, and there on the sand, like a giant lizard, or a flexible crocodile, or a serpent with legs, huge and horrible and lumpy, lay the dragon. But when it saw them, instead of rising up and blowing fire and smoke, the dragon retreated. You could almost say it waddled back into the shallows of the bay. "What's it wagging its head like that for?" said Edmund. "And now it's nodding," said Caspian. "There's something coming from its eyes," said Drinian.
"Can't you see?" said Lucy. "It's crying. They're tears."
"Oh, I shouldn't trust to that, ma'am. That's what crocodiles do to put you off your guard."
"It wagged its head when you said that," remarked Edmund, "just as if it meant no. Look, there it goes again." "Do you think it understands what we're saying?" asked Lucy.
The dragon nodded its head violently. Repeat-Sheep slipped off Lucy's shoulder and stepped to the front.
"Dragon, can you understand speech?"
The dragon nodded.
"Can you speak?"
It shook its head.
"Then it is idle to ask you your business. But if you will swear friendship with us, raise your left foreleg above your head."
It did so, but clumsily, because that leg was sore and swollen with the golden bracelet.
"Oh, look, there's something wrong with its leg. Oh, the poor thing, that's probably what it was crying about. Perhaps it's come to us to be cured, like in Androcles and the lion."
"Oh, be careful, Lucy," said Caspian. "It's a very clever dragon, but it may be a liar." Lucy had, however, already run forward, followed by Repeat-Sheep as fast as his short legs could carry him, and then, of course, the boys and Drinian came too.
"Show me your paw," said Lucy. "I might be able to cure it."
The dragon that had been Eustace held out its sore leg gladly enough, remembering how Lucy's cordial had cured him of seasickness before he became a dragon. But he was disappointed. The magic fluid reduced the swelling and eased the pain a little, but it could not dissolve the gold. Everyone had now crowded round to watch the treatment, and Caspian suddenly exclaimed, "Look!" He was staring at the bracelet. Chapter 7. How the Adventure Ended. "Look at what?" said Edmund. "Look at the device on the gold," said Caspian. "It's a little hammer with a diamond above it like a star," said Drinian. "Why, I've seen that before." "Seen it?" said Caspian. "Why, of course you have. It is the sign of a great Narnian house. This is the Lord Octavian's arm-ring."
"Villain!"
said Reepicheep to the dragon.
"Have you devoured a Narnian lord?"
But the dragon shook his head violently. "Or perhaps," said Lucy, "this is the Lord Octavian turned into a dragon, under an enchantment, you know." "It needn't be either," said Edmund. "All dragons collect gold, but I think it's a safe guess that Octavian got no further than this island." "Are you the Lord Octavian?" The dragon sadly shook its head. "Are you someone enchanted? Someone human, I mean?" It nodded violently. And then someone said, people disputed afterwards whether Lucy or Edmund said it first, You're not Eustace by any chance?" And Eustace nodded his terrible dragon head and thumped his tail in the sea, and everyone skipped back, some of the tailors of ejaculations I will not put down in writing, to avoid the enormous and boiling tears which flowed from his eyes. Lucy tried hard to console him, and even screwed her courage to kiss the scaly face, and nearly everyone said hard luck, and several assured Eustace that they would all stand by him, and many said there was sure to be some way of disenchanting him, and they'd have him as right as rain in a day or two. And of course they were all very anxious to hear his story, but he couldn't speak. More than once in the days that followed he attempted to write it for them on the sand, but this never succeeded. In the first place, Eustace, never having read the right books, had no idea how to tell a story straight, and for another thing the muscles and nerves of the dragon's claws that he had to use had never learned to write, and were not built for writing anyway. As a result, he never got nearly to the end before the tide came in and washed away all the writing, except the bits he'd already trodden on or accidentally swished out of his tail, and all that anyone had seen would be something like this, the dots of the bits he had smudged out. "I went to sleep, ... Rgos Agrons, Drangon's cave, 'cause it was dead and aining. So hard, ... woke up and see, oh, you, ... get off my arm, oh, bother, ... It was, however, clear to everyone that Eustace's character had been rather improved by becoming a dragon. He was anxious to help. He flew over the whole island, and found that it was all mountainous, and inhabited only by wild goats and droves of wild swine. Of these he brought back many carcasses as provisions for the ship. He was a very humane killer, too, for he would dispatch a beast with one blow of his tail, so that it didn't know, and presumably still does not know, it had been killed. He ate a few himself, of course, but always alone, for now that he was a dragon he liked his food raw, but he could never bear to let others see him at his messy meals. And one day, flying slowly and wearily, but in great triumph, he bore back to camp a great tall pine tree, which he had torn up by the roots in a distant valley, and which could be made into a capital mast. And in the evening, if it turned chilly, as it sometimes did after the heavy rains, he was a comfort to everyone, for the whole party would come and sit with their backs against his hot sides, and get well warmed and dried, and one puff of his fiery breath would light the most obstinate fire. Sometimes he would take a select party for a fly on his back, so that they could see, wheeling below them, the green slopes, the rocky heights, the narrow pit-like valleys, and far out over the sea to the eastward, a spot of darker blue on the dark horizon, which might be land. The pleasure, quite new to him, of being liked, and still more, of liking other people, was what kept Eustace from despair, for it was very dreary being a dragon. He shuddered whenever he caught sight of his own reflection as he flew over a mountain lake. He hated the huge bat-like wings, the sore-edged ridge on his back, and the cruel curved claws. He was almost afraid to be alone with himself, and yet he was ashamed to be with the others. On the evenings when he was not being used as a hot water bottle, and lie curled up like a snake between the wood and the water. On such occasions, greatly to his surprise, Reepicheep was his most constant comforter. The noble mouse would creep away from the merry circle at the campfire, and sit down by the dragon's head, well to the windward to be out of the way of his smoky breath, and then he would explain that what had happened to Eustace was a striking illustration of the turn of fortune's wheel, and that if he had Eustace at his own house in Narnia, it was really a hole, not a house, and the dragon's head, let alone his body, would not have fitted in. He could show him more than 100 examples of emperors, kings, dukes, knights, poets, lovers, astronomers, philosophers, and magicians, who had fallen from prosperity into the most distressing circumstances, and of whom many had recovered and lived happily ever afterward. It did not, perhaps, seem so very comforting at the time, but it was kindly meant, and Eustace never forgot it. But of course, what hung over everyone like a cloud was the problem of what to do with their dragon when they were ready to sail. They tried not to talk of it when he was there, but he couldn't help overhearing things, like, "Would he fit all along one side of the deck? We'd have to shift all the stores to the other side down below so as to balance. Would towing him be any good? Would he be able to keep up by flying? And most often of all, but how are we to feed him?" And poor Eustace realized more and more that since the first day he came on board, he had been an unmitigated nuisance, and that he was now a greater nuisance still. And this ate into his mind, just as that bracelet ate into his foreleg. He knew that it only made it worse to tear at, with his great teeth, but he couldn't help tearing now and then, especially on hot nights. About 6 days after they'd landed on Dragon Island, Edmund happened to wake up very early one morning. It was just getting grey, so that you could see the tree trunks if they were between you and the bay, but not in the other direction. As he woke, he thought he heard something moving, and presently he thought he saw a dark figure moving on the seaward side of a wood. The idea that had once occurred to his mind was, "Are we so sure there are no natives on this island after all?" Then he thought it was Caspian. It was about the right size, but he knew that Caspian had been sleeping next to him, and he could see that he hadn't moved. Edmund made sure that his sword was in its place, and then rose to investigate. He came down softly to the edge of the wood, and the dark figure was still there. He saw now that it was too small for Caspian, and too big for Lucy. It did not run away. Edmund drew his sword, and was about to challenge the stranger, when the stranger said, in a low voice, "Is that you, Edmund?" "Yes. Who are you?" "Don't you know me?" "It's me, Eustace." "By Jove! So it is! My dear chap!" "Hush," said Eustace, and lurched as if he were going to fall. "Hello," said Edmund, steadying him. "What's up? Ah, are you ill?" Eustace was silent for so long that Edmund thought he was fainting. But at last he said, "It's been ghastly. You don't know, but it's all right now. Can we go and talk somewhere? I don't want to meet the others just yet." Yes, rather, anywhere you like. We can go and sit on the rocks over there. I say, I am glad to see you, well, looking yourself again. You must have had a pretty beastly time." They went to the rocks and sat down, looking out across the bay, while the sky got paler and paler, and the stars disappeared, except for one very bright one, low down by the near horizon. "I won't tell you how I became a dragon till I tell the others and get it all over with. By the way, I didn't even know it was a dragon till I heard you all using the word when I turned up here the other morning. I want to tell you how I stopped being one. Fire ahead." Well, last night I was more miserable than ever, and that beastly armouring was hurting like anything. Is that all right now?" Eustace laughed, a different laugh from any Edmund had heard him give before, and slipped the bracelet easily off his arm. "There it is, and anyone who likes can have it as far as I'm concerned. Well, as I say, I was lying awake and wondering what on earth would become of me. And then, mind you, it may have all been a dream, I don't know." "Go on," said Edmund, with considerable patience. "Well, anyway, I looked up and I saw the very last thing I expected. A huge lion coming towards me. And one queer thing was there was no moon last night, but there was moonlight where the lion was. So it came nearer and nearer. I was terribly afraid of it. You may think that being a dragon I would have knocked a lion out easily enough, but it wasn't that kind of fear. I wasn't afraid of it eating me, I was just afraid of it, if you can understand. Well, it came close up to me and looked straight into my eyes, and I shut my eyes tight. But that wasn't any good, because it told me to follow it." "You mean it spoke?" "I don't know. Now that you mention it, I don't think it did. But it told me all the same, and I knew I'd have to do what it told me. So I got up and followed it, and it led me a long way into the mountains. And there was always this moonlight over and round the lion wherever we went. So at last we came to the top of a mountain I'd never seen before, and on the top of this mountain there was a garden, trees and fruit and everything, and in the middle of it there was a well. I knew it was a well because you could see the water bubbling up from the bottom of it, but it was a lot bigger than most wells, like a very big round bath, with marble steps going down into it. The water was as clear as anything, and I thought if I could get in there and bathe, it would ease the pain in my leg. But the lion told me I would have to undress first. Mind you, I don't know if it said any words out loud or not. I was just going to say that I couldn't undress because I hadn't any clothes on, when I suddenly thought, dragons are snaky sorts of things, and snakes can cast their skins. Of course, thought I, that's what the dragon means. So I started scratching myself, and my scales began coming off all over the place. And then I scratched a little deeper, and instead of just scales coming off here and there, my whole skin started peeling off, beautifully, like it does after an illness, or as if I was a banana. In a minute or two I just stepped out of it. I could see it lying there beside me, looking rather nasty. It was a most lovely feeling. So I started to go down into the well for my bathe. But just as I was going to put my feet into the water, I looked down and saw that they were all hard and rough, and wrinkled and scaly, just as they'd been before. "Well, that's all right," said I. "It only means I have another smaller suit on underneath the first one. I'll have to get that off too." So I scratched and tore again, and this underskin peeled off beautifully, and out I stepped and left it lying beside the other one, and went down to the well for my bathe. Well, exactly the same thing happened again, and I thought to myself, "Oh dear, how many skins have I got to take off?" For I was longing to bathe my leg. So I scratched away for the third time, and got off a third skin, just like the two others, and stepped out of it. But as soon as I looked at myself in the water, I knew it had been no good. Then the lion said, I don't know if it spoke. It said, "You will have to let me undress you." I was afraid of those claws, I can tell you, but I was pretty nearly desperate now, so I just lay flat down on my back and let him do it. The very first tear he made was so deep, I thought it had gone into my heart. And when he began pulling the skin off, it hurt worse than anything I ever felt. The only thing that made me able to bear it was the pleasure of feeling the stuff peel off, you know? If you've ever picked a scab on a sore place, it hurts like billy-o. It's such fun to see it coming away. I know exactly what you mean. Well, he peeled the beastly stuff right off, just as I thought I'd done myself the other 3 times, only they hadn't hurt. And there it was, lying on the grass, only ever so much thicker and darker and more knobbly looking than the others had been. And there was I, as smooth and soft as a peeled switch, and smaller than I'd been. Then he caught hold of me, and I didn't like that much, for I was very tender underneath now. I'd no skin on. And he threw me into the water. It smarted like anything, but only for a moment. After that it became perfectly delicious.
and as soon as I started swimming and splashing, I found that all the pain had gone from my arm. And I saw why. I turned into a boy again. You think me pretty phony if I told you how I felt about my arms. I know they've no muscle. They're pretty mouldy compared with Caspian's, but I was so glad to see them. After a bit, the lion took me out and dressed me. Dressed you? With his paws? I don't know. I don't remember that bit. But somehow or other, he must have, in new clothes. For once I've got on now. And suddenly I was back here. Which makes me think it was a dream. No, it wasn't a dream. Why not? Well, there are the clothes, for one thing. And, well, you've been undragoned for another. What do you think it was, then? I think you've seen Aslan. Aslan? I've heard that name mentioned several times since we joined the Dawn Treader. I felt, I don't know, I hated it. But I was hating everything then. By the way, I'd like to apologise. I'm afraid I've been pretty beastly. Oh, that's all right. Between ourselves, you haven't been as bad as I was on my first trip to Narnia. You were only an ass, but I was a traitor. Don't tell me about it, then. But who is Aslan? How do you know him? Well, he knows me. He's the great lion, the son of the Emperor beyond the sea, who saved me and saved Narnia. We've all seen him. Lucy sees him most often. And it may be Aslan's country we're sailing to. Neither said anything for a while. The last bright star had vanished, and though they could not see the sunrise because of the mountains on their right, they knew it was going on because the sky above them and the bay before them turned the colour of roses. Then some bird of the parrot kind screamed in the woods behind them, and they heard movements among the trees, and finally a blast on Caspian's horn. The camp was astir. Great was the rejoicing when Edmund and the restored Eustace walked into the breakfast circle round the campfire. Now, of course, everyone heard the earlier part of his story. People wondered whether the other dragon had killed the Lord Octavian several years ago, or whether Octavian himself had been the old dragon. The jewels with which Eustace had crammed his pockets in the cave had disappeared, along with the clothes he had been wearing. But no one, least of all Eustace himself, felt any desire to go back to that valley for more treasure. In a few days now, the Dawn Treader, remastered, repainted, and well stored, was ready to sail. Before they embarked, Caspian caused to be cut on the smooth cliff facing the bay the words, "Dragon Island, discovered by Caspian X, King of Narnia, etc., in the 4th year of his reign. Here, as we suppose, the Lord Octavian had his death." It would be nice, and fairly nearly true, to say that from that time forth Eustace was a different boy. To be strictly accurate, he'd began to be a different boy. He had relapses. There were still many days when he could be very tiresome, but most of those I shall not notice. The cure had begun. The Lord Octavian's arm ring had a curious fate. Eustace did not want it, and offered it to Caspian, and Caspian offered it to Lucy. She did not care about having it. "Very well, then," said Caspian. "Catch as catch can." He flung it up into the air. This was when they were all standing looking at the inscription. Up went the ring, flashing in the sunlight, and caught and hung as neatly as a well-thrown quoit on a little projection on the rock. No one could climb up to get it from below, and no one could climb down to get it from above. And there, for all I know, it is hanging still, and may hang till that world ends.